All right, let's dive in. Today, we're talking about a name that I'm sure pretty much everyone recognizes, Zantac. For years, it was the go-to solution for heartburn. And then, poof, it just disappeared from store shelves.
So yeah, whatever happened to Zantac? If you've ever stood in a pharmacy aisle, looked at the empty space where it used to be, and thought that exact same thing, well, you've come to the right place.
Because this isn't just some boring product recall notice. No, this is the absolutely wild story of how a blockbuster, miracle drug, one that was trusted by millions of people all over the world, just vanished, seemingly overnight.
To really get why its fall was so dramatic, we first have to understand just how huge its rise was. Before it disappeared, Zantac, or Ranitidine as it's technically called, was an absolute giant in the world of medicine.
Okay, so its scientific name is ranitidine, and it's what's known as an H2 blocker. Its whole job, its only job, was to tell your stomach to chill out and produce less acid. And let me tell you, it was unbelievably good at it. For years, this was one of the most prescribed drugs on the entire planet for everything from just your average heartburn to more serious stuff like GERD and peptic ulcers.
And this wasn't some new kid on the block. We're talking about decades of people relying on this stuff. For millions, Zantac was literally the definition of reliable, effective relief. It was a true hero of the medicine cabinet.
But the way it worked, the science behind it was actually pretty clever and, kind of elegant. It basically used a fake key trick to stop acid production in its tracks. Let's break down how that worked. So first, you gotta meet the main character in this story, the parietal cell. Just think of these as tiny little acid factories that are all along the lining of your stomach. Their one and only job is to pump out hydrochloric acid.
But how do these little factories know when to turn on? Well, they're waiting for a signal, and that signal comes from a molecule called histamine. Histamine is the messenger that shows up and basically gives the order, all right, let's go, start pumping out that acid.
So here's where the genius of Zantac comes in. Imagine the cell has a receptor on it that's like a lock, and histamine is the key, right? Normally, the key goes in the lock, turns it, and boom, the acid factory fires up. But ranitidine, well, it's like a perfectly shaped fake key. It gets to the lock first, slides right in, and just camps out. So when the real key, histamine, comes along, there's no room for it. The lock is already taken. The signal never gets through, and the acid factory just stays quiet. Simple as that.
And for decades, that was the whole story. A simple, brilliant mechanism in a super effective drug. But it turns out there was a hidden flaw, a ticking time bomb, you could say, baked right into the drug's molecular DNA.
Yep, this hero drug had a secret, and it turned out to be a fatal one that would eventually bring the whole thing crashing down.
That flaw has a name, NDMA. It's officially classified as a probable human carcinogen. Now look, it's in our environment in tiny, tiny amounts, even in some foods, but it is not something you want forming in any significant amount inside the medicine you're taking every day. So where was this NDMA coming from? This was the bombshell discovery. It wasn't some contamination at the factory. The problem was the ranitidine molecule itself. It was just fundamentally inherently unstable.
And once that discovery was made in 2019, man, the dominoes fell fast. An online pharmacy called ValueSure figured out that the molecule could literally break down and turn into NDMA, especially if it was exposed to heat. This, of course, triggered massive investigations from the FDA and regulators all over the world. And by April 2020, that was it. The story was over. The FDA put out the call for a complete withdrawal of every ranitidine product from the market.
Which, leads to the big question, right? If this drug was around for decades and millions upon millions of people were taking it, how on earth was this fatal flaw not found sooner?
Well, the answer really boils down to two things: timing and technology. Back when ranitidine first got approved, the scientific tools we had just weren't sensitive enough to detect this kind of slow molecular breakdown. It really took modern, super-sensitive lab techniques, plus a whole new focus from regulators on these kinds of impurities to finally uncover a risk that had been hiding in plain sight for years. So, with this new discovery on the table, it led to the one, single, unavoidable decision that made Zantac vanish from our pharmacies.
At the end of the day, the conclusion was pretty straightforward. The potential for this drug to create a probable carcinogen right inside its own bottle, well, that was just an unacceptable risk to patient health. Full stop. Putting patient safety first meant a total recall was the only thing they could do. So, with this absolute blockbuster of a drug now gone, what about all the people who needed it?
The good news is, the world of medicine was more than ready, with plenty of safe and effective alternatives.
The main options really fall into 3 buckets. You've still got other H2 blockers that work just like ranitidine did. Then there are the more powerful proton pump inhibitors, or PPIs, which go straight to the source and block the acid pumps themselves. And of course, you've always got your basic antacids that just neutralize the acid that's already sloshing around.
And here's the key takeaway for anyone who used to rely on Zantac. Another H2 blocker called famotidine, you probably know it as Pepcid, has pretty much stepped in to fill that gap. It works in a really similar way, but, and this is the crucial part, its molecule is stable. It doesn't have that same scary NDMA problem.
So when you look back at the whole story, ranitidine has this fascinating kind of dual legacy, you know? On one hand, it was a totally groundbreaking medicine that helped millions and millions of people. But on the other hand, its downfall is one of the most important cautionary tales in modern medicine.
It's really a powerful lesson, a lesson about just how important it is to keep monitoring drugs even after they hit the market, and how what we think we know about a medicine's safety can change in a huge way when new science comes along.
And that leaves us with one last kind of big question to chew on. For decades, Zantac was thought to be completely safe. Millions of us took it without a second thought, and then, one day, it wasn't. So it really makes you wonder, what's the next big lesson we're going to learn from the drugs we all trust and use today?